Hi, I'm Ian Mean. I'm editor of the Western Daily Press. I've just been interviewing Xavier Rolet. He is the chief executive of the London Stock Exchange. He's talking this evening as part of the University of West of England Distinguished Executive Address Series, which the Bristol News and Media, of which the Western Daily Press and the Bristol Post are part, have the privilege of sponsoring. Now, Xavier, you're chief executive of the London Stock Exchange. You don't strike me as the archetypal city type, are you?
Well, growing up in a sink estate might do that to you. So perhaps not from that standpoint.
In Paris?
In eastern Paris, yes. So perhaps you have a point there. That said, what I developed early on, particularly as I left my native country very young and emigrated to America, is a sense that accomplishments ultimately are not so much a function of where you come from, but how ambitious and how motivated and how hard-working a person you are or prepared to be. And I think I have found that in the UK. I've now been a resident of the UK for 27 years. I'm starting perhaps not to sound like a British citizen, but certainly like to think like one. And what strikes me in the United Kingdom today is the remarkable opportunity, particularly the one that is open to university students, to young scientists, is this combination of financial expertise, knowing how to raise capital, the ability to produce world-class science, and that has gone unabated for 300 years, but also the combination between financial expertise, the availability of capital, that capability to produce science, but the desire to become an entrepreneur. That combination is unique in Europe. Europe counts today 23 million small and mid-sized enterprise. If you want the core of that innovative capacity, the UK is home to 4.8 million of these small and mid-sized enterprise, and is by any standard leading the European Union. So Britain continues to be great. In fact, has never ceased to be great when you look at these three attributes. And I'm here today, here in Bristol, perhaps to discuss that with the members of the audience, but also to celebrate those successes. Bristol itself is a remarkable, successful experience in that respect. There is a new technology revolution. I know the industrial revolution happened in great part here, and we're celebrating here in this hallowed ground of industrial revolution. But there is a technology revolution going on. Not everybody has noticed it. We've seen it at the London Stock Exchange. It's remarkable. It's one of the reasons why the UK is leading the world in terms of economic performance and job creation.
Do we hide that under a bushel a little bit, that performance?
We don't hide it, but maybe we're a little bit shy about advertising it. And it's not a question of just pride, because it's a remarkable accomplishment. Turning around an economy like many of our neighbors was hit pretty hard by the financial contraction and crisis of 2008. Turning it around, but underpinning that growth by the power of innovation, the power of small and mid-sized enterprises, which are the companies that are creating these good jobs, these high-quality jobs. And that, if you look at aggregate economic performance, look at the United States, Canada, the rest of Europe, the UK is leading the Western world. And perhaps we need to be a little more adept at making the successes known in terms of attracting more entrepreneurs, more investors to the UK. Investors always ask me, wherever I travel around the world, where should we put our money? And for a long time, emerging markets was the story, and we have the commodity story and many others. And I say, look right here at home. The tech revolution, companies progressing, growing at 2, 3, 4, 500% a year, underpinning outstanding science on a really competitive on a global scale. You can find those investment opportunities right here at home. A lot of small, medium-sized growing companies. And this is where we should start. This is our job. This is what the London Stock Exchange does for the
good. Now, what do you think the main hurdles are, Xavier, and challenges for the UK economy over the next year, couple of years? We've got a general election next year. That's going to be quite important.
Of course, the political agenda and calendar is above my pay grade. We are a completely neutral organization in that standpoint. What I think is the number one challenge, given that the UK economy is now outperforming most, if not all, of our neighbors, so it is creating new wealth, it is creating new riches, is to ensure that the gap that does exist today, let's not deny it, between citizens and that very advanced, innovative, productive economy, that gap is bridged. And I think by returning to some of the lessons that were learned in the 80s, 25 years ago, that sharing that wealth with a wider population, i.e. giving access to individual investors in small size, in what we call in our jargon, the retail business, sharing that wealth, the growth of that economy, of that innovation, of these new companies, these great technologies. Graphene is an example, for example, software, biotech, ensuring that we design the proper ways for that wealth as it is created rapidly to be shared a little more equitably. To me, the number one challenge, if we address that, and it's not just salary growth, it's participating in capital accumulation, capital creation. If we can share that better, I think the legitimacy of our capital markets-based economy will no longer be challenged. This is, by the way, a form of economic governance that was invented right here several hundred years ago. We've not come up with a better one. We've tried many other forms and they've led, in some cases, to some pretty atrocious results. So let's focus on that to ensure that not only capital is shared, but also capital is distributed at the bottom, i.e. at the entrepreneur level. Let's focus on the retailization. I hate this jargon, but the allocation of that wealth, the distribution amongst the wider population. I think this is the next challenge for the UK. I am convinced that if we continue the efforts that have been undertaken in the last few years, we'll look back in 5 years' time, not more than that, and we'll see a very robust, very energetic tech and innovation-based UK economy, frankly, giving a bit of a challenge to our American friends, and by far leading any other European country. So we have an opportunity to lead the way. We started. Not everybody has noticed it. I'm glad it's been noticed in Bristol, but I do think the UK is onto something which I call effectively a second revolution, a tech revolution.
Now, using your words, Xavier, you say it's all there for the taking, and the audience tonight, there'll be a lot of students from the University of West of England there. Is that right? Is it there for the taking?
It is. If you're working hard, if you have an innovative contribution to make to the economy, it can be pure science, it could be a new form of service, it can be an application, it can be a different way of doing effectively the same old services, or reinventing some traditional businesses. But if you have that, and if you work hard, capital is available. And infrastructure companies like the London Stock Exchange are there to help those entrepreneurs. We launched a couple of weeks ago a new initiative called Elite, which is a nationwide UK initiative where we're inviting companies to work with us, to work on their business plan, to meet with private investors, to prepare them for life in public markets, to help them raise their business plan as well as corporate governance. We provide them a lot of guidance, and to help them do the things that they're not necessarily best at doing. They're focusing on innovation, they're focusing on the products, they're focusing on sales and clients. The capital raising part sometimes can be a bit of a question mark, or not something necessarily that entrepreneurs are best at doing. So those opportunities are available, and I would say to a young, ambitious student, it's all right here. Capital, the science within universities like UWE, but also the entrepreneurial spirit. And this is something that the government, I think, has shown in the last few years that they're prepared to back. If you look at regulatory reform, fiscal reform, a range of initiatives to support capital raising for small, startup and young companies.
And do you think there's enough backing from the government for these small startup companies?
Very much so. For one simple fact, and I think this is a reality that is slowly growing in the consciousness of our European neighbors. If you look at the potential sources of new jobs, there really are only three sources. Historically, the government has created a lot of jobs, and I think the UK economy in the last 3.5 years has destroyed about 500,000 government jobs. And if you look at the rest of Europe, it's even worse, given the debt situation and the commitments that government have made, who have resulted in them being overextended. The second source is, of course, the blue chips. But we all agree that today governments are not going to create new jobs. They are under pressures to deleverage and basically reduce their debt. The second area being blue chips. If you look at the last 3 years of strongly rising corporate earnings, 2005, 2006, and 2007, it's obviously been patchy since then, although it's recovering now quite strongly. But even in these 3 years of strongly rising earnings, blue chips in the UK, Germany, Italy, France, the four largest economies in Western Europe, in aggregate, did not create any new jobs. By definition, they're a very large company, they tend to operate global businesses, and they're very sensitive to cost pressures, competitive pressures, be they from Asia, from the United States. Today, the United States is really undergoing a renaissance as a very, very powerful industrial competitor. Very low energy costs, very flexible labor market, low cost of capital. So these blue chips find it difficult to create new jobs in what is still a relatively high cost environment. That leaves small and mid-sized enterprises as frankly the only potential source of new jobs. And not only new jobs, but good jobs, high quality jobs underpinned by innovation, which gives you pricing power, which offers you the ability to pay good salaries, particularly to university graduates. And I think the UK government is really onto that. I think they're doing the right things. I believe that example, given that the UK economy is growing at north of 3%, which is the fastest rate of economic growth in the Western world, is starting to attract the attention of other governments, particularly across the channel, governments who are not scoring the same sort of economic performance. And I'm very hopeful, and I do hope that governments in the European Union emulate the UK government, because faster growth in the Eurozone will benefit UK business. 50% plus of UK exports are into the Eurozone. So it's a question of leadership, of showing, if you want, the example. And I think that's starting to happen. I'm quite optimistic that a number of governments that in the past in the European Union perhaps were not driving that SME agenda are now thinking it through and offering new hope for entrepreneurs.
Good. Now, the banking crisis has been a defining period for business. Do you think this is a passing phase?
If one looks at, let's say, the history of capital markets in let's pick the last 300 years, every single major financial crisis that we have lived through and suffered through has been caused, unfortunately and rigorously, by the same situation. It has had the same impact and the same effects, and it's our inability to control leverage in the banking industry. And debt coming out of the banking sector can be a very powerful accelerator of economic growth. But if leverage grows beyond level that enable the capital of the banks to withstand possible losses, and we're talking here in 2008 about banks that leverage their balance sheets 30, 40, 50 times, and we've done this many times before. If we're unable to monitor and control that leverage, we are going to fall, I fear, in the future into effectively the same situation. And what we are advocating is a recalibration of the financing ecosystem, a recalibration in favor of risk capital, equity, and a recalibration that would diminish the reliance of corporate funding on bank lending. Not that bank lending is a bad way of financing companies, particularly large ones. It's actually quite effective. But particularly for startups and small and mid-sized enterprise, what entrepreneurs need is not so much bank lending, where the returns are capped and don't account for the economic risk of a startup. 1 in 3 businesses go bust in the first 3 years of existence. But what entrepreneurs need is a form of capital that does not require lien, a mortgage, for example, on their home, does not require interest payment starting in the first month, but provides unlimited upside to the investor in exchange for the downside risk also being assumed by the investor. That's the definition of equity. It was invented here, and we believe the recalibration of the fiscal system in favor of equity, which remain taxed 4 times their life cycle in the UK. At the corporate level, at the capital gains level, dividends, as well as our homegrown financial transaction tax, the stamp duty, versus deductibility of interest for financial services companies. So that recalibration, we believe, will accelerate job creation and the growth pattern of small and mid-sized enterprise. This is very much what the UK government has done in the last couple of years. For example, including AIM stocks, our growth market, in individual savings account, repeal of the stamp duty that became effective last week, again for growth companies, making the enterprise investment scheme permanent, as well as a range of other measures, including some regulatory measures, to facilitate, if you want, to remove some of the shackles, the fiscal shackles that had affected equity. And equity always attracts fiscal attention. Look at the debate in Europe about the financial transaction tax, and it is no surprise that in the end, the only agreement that governments in the European Union could find is to tax equities. This is what symbolizes the rest of the system. Unfortunately, it is a long-term source of risk capital, and if we continue to tax it and regulate it, potentially to death, we hinder the ability of entrepreneurs to create those jobs. This is what is well understood in this country, and which I hope our European neighbours will pick up.
Good. Now, I'm a small SME in the Bristol area. You come and see my business because you go and see a lot of clients.
I do.
What are you looking for to give me confidence and to give you confidence that you can recommend me for investment?
First of all, it's about people. It's about a management team, science, of course, investors, as likely there will be in terms of first or second stage financing, but it's really about a story. How convincing is that story going to be to investors? Is this a group of entrepreneurs who are passionate about their business? How do they look at things? Are they truly innovative? Which potentially means disruptive too. Yeah. So is there new value, new wealth, new ways of doing business that's being created there? And can that enthusiasm and passion be then communicate to investors who are going to see the long-term future growth of that business? That's the first thing I look for. The rest, of course, from the governance to the financials, to the integrity, to sort of what we call due diligence in our jargon. Sort of the integrity of the business and the performance is very important. Those metrics are expected by investors. But it all starts with human beings.
And one quality you look for above anything?
Humility. And the reason I say humility is often as an entrepreneur, you're going to go through periods of failure, setbacks, and the ability to pick yourself up, learn from that setback. And this is something that I think is, on occasion, a legitimate criticism, which is addressed at this sort of European culture, the European mindset, versus the American attitude. You actually do need some failures at some point to progress and ultimately to become a success. So all the other things I take for granted, great education, great science, innovativeness, you will not fundamentally differentiate yourself from thousands of other entrepreneurs who also have great ideas, are very hardworking and passionate, and there are quite a few of those around. But the ability to rebound when you make a mistake, that is, in my mind, the difference between potentially greatness and, not so great performance.
Thank you, Xavier.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.